Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today for this webinar of the politics of economics. We're really glad to have you all here. My name's Alice Pearson, I'm one of the organisers. Today we have Jana Bacevic, who has two PhDs, one in anthropology, one in sociology. She is currently a research associate at Cambridge in sociology and education. She's just got a lectureship at Durham, so she'll be moving up there shortly. And her latest article is Knowing Neoliberalism, which is published in the Journal of Social Epistemology. And Jana's latest PhD was on neoliberalism, performativity, and universities, and the kind of interaction of those three. And she's going to be kind of continuing a little bit on that theme today on the question of performing social science. Jana will be in conversation. She'll do a brief presentation and then be in conversation with Cléo, Chassonnery-Zaïgouche. Cléo is one of our organisers. She has a PhD from La Sorbonne on the history of the economics of race. She's a research associate at CRASSH in the politics of, in the research under and the expertise under pressure group. And she has a recent article out in the Journal of the History of Political, History of Economic Thought on the role of economists in court. Okay, so before we go on, I'd just like to do the brief poll that we've been doing in these webinars. If you can just, if you can see on the screen there, there's a quick poll. I'm going to give you about 20 seconds or so to do that. There's 4 questions. The first is on geography, the second gender. We like to get an idea of our audience. The third is which discipline you would have liked to have heard more from during this crisis. And the last is which discipline you identify with. So I'm just going to give you a few seconds to do that. And while we do, I'll mention the upcoming webinars that we have planned. Our next scheduled one is just less than 2 weeks on Tuesday, the 7th of July at 1 p.m. That will be Will Davies speaking in conversation. We also have webinars coming up with Mary Morgan and Lisa Cook, so look out for the dates of those. I think this poll, how are we doing? Yeah, okay, great. We'll close the poll there. That's interesting, thank you. And I'll just, when you're putting down, when we get to question and answer later in the webinar about 20, 30 minutes before the end, please post your questions in the chat function so that I'll either read them out or pass them over to you. And please also be aware that this is being live streamed to YouTube and recorded, and it might also be published there at a later date, potentially without the questions. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand over to Jana and Cléo.
Right, shall I start? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Alice, for the introduction. Thank you, Cléo, and the whole Politics of Economics team for the invitation. It's great to be here or not here. I'm not sure how we now refer to digital environments. I will be giving a very short introduction concerning what I'll be talking about today, and then I look forward to a discussion with Cléo and obviously with all of you. And looking at the poll, I will, sorry, yeah, there we go. Looking at the poll, I was equally surprised and not surprised to see that sociologists seem to be the dominant. This is a very brief overview. Yes, sociologists are certainly the dominant group among participants, or at least among participants who did complete the poll. But there is a relatively high representation of economics or economists, and also people who do not identify with any of the disciplines listed. And sociology is also in the lead in terms of what disciplines people who have answered to the questions in the poll would have liked to have heard more about during the current crisis. And one of the things that I will be talking about is whether this means that in some ways we are anyway likely to overemphasize the relevance and the contribution of our own disciplines or disciplines that we identify with. But more interestingly, what does this mean? And most pertinent to this discussion, what it means to the current, or what it means in the context of the current crisis. So one of the reasons why the team of politics of economics approached me to contribute to the seminar series, which I've also been following quite closely and enjoying very much, by the way, is, I presume at least, because I've also published 3, as a matter of fact, short pieces on the use of science and scientific evidence in the corona crisis. And one of the reasons why I became interested in this particular issue or context in relation to everything else that I do is because obviously in the context of the corona crisis, we have seen repeatedly, both in the UK, but also in many other countries, this assumption that what governments are doing is following scientific advice. So we've very much seen the forefronting of the role of scientific advisory committees and science as a very particular form of knowledge, as a form of justification for policy decisions that are taken or not taken. But what does this mean? So one of the things that I have been writing about and have published on is, first of all, the question of how scientific knowledge and expertise are being enlisted in the COVID-19 pandemic. So not only by governments, obviously, but also by other social and political actors. And then more interestingly for me, when we talk about scientific knowledge or expertise, what kind of knowledge and expertise are we actually talking about? Obviously, we often, when we talk about science, we often talk of science in terms of disciplines and sometimes following the division between science, which in this case most often means STEM, and then social sciences and humanities. But clearly, if we group all of that under the aegis of science, we also need to ask what kind of disciplinary knowledge and expertise is not used in this case. So what gets left out? What is excluded from the production of scientific evidence that is used in order to justify certain political decisions? And that brings us to the most interesting question, both for me and I'm assuming for most of you today, which is the question of the politics of knowledge and expertise. One of the comments or one of the interpretations of, if we would put it somewhat euphemistically, UK government's variable success in handling the coronavirus pandemic has been that they have just enlisted the wrong sort of experts. And this narrative itself diverges significantly from the other dominant narrative in society, which is that experts are on the whole losing their position in terms of being able to influence policy. This position itself, we've seen sometimes reflected as the idea of so the crisis of expertise, post-truth, and so on and so forth. But this is another sort of critique. This sort of critique says, well, clearly some sort of science is being used, but it's the wrong sort of science. And for instance, the Financial Times have not that long ago suggested that perhaps what the strategy for handling the pandemic needed were more economists and more behavioral scientists. That in and of itself is a slightly odd suggestion. If we look at the structure of scientific advice when it came to the UK case of the coronavirus pandemic, and I'm sure you all of you by now know this almost by heart, so I will just jog through it very, very quickly. So the chief source of scientific advice to the UK government, and more specifically to its COBRA team, is the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, or SAGE. SAGE is comprised of a number of subcommittees. The focus in the media has overwhelmingly been on SPIM, so the group that did mathematical modeling of the spread of the epidemic. But most of the advice on social elements of the pandemic has actually been gathered through SPIB, which is a scientific or subcommittee, a group that is mostly comprised of behavioral scientists, in this case, social psychologists. SPIB, of course, doesn't only produce evidence on the basis of what its own members think, but also receives expert advice from external experts. And there is a very interesting list here that I've extracted from one of the documents, which lists health psychology, social psychology, anthropology, and history. But going back to our question, it's obvious that some disciplines are excluded from this, or some disciplinary perspectives are excluded from this. For instance, what about sociology? What about public health? What about those who focus on gender? What about geography, which, for instance, might have suggested or might have had something to say about how people move about, including move about in urban environments, thus making it obvious that controlling viral spread in, for instance, public transport in, for instance, places like London would have been, if not impossible, and certainly very difficult. So when we talk about disciplinary influence, we're not only talking about who gets a seat at the table, but how do disciplines actually act? What is it that they do? What does scientific knowledge do? And this brings me to one of my, as Alice has suggested, one of my main theoretical interests or preoccupations, which is the question of performativity. And more specifically, the performativity of statements that are usually identified as scientific knowledge statements. The idea of performativity has a longer history in philosophy, and I have listed only some of the more prominent theorists who have dealt with it in different ways. It has itself been derived from Austin's work on speech acts, and then received different interpretations by people including Judith Butler-Braille Langton and Sarah Ahmed, all of which I think are very interesting and relevant to what we will be discussing. But more specifically, when it comes to the role of economics, performativity received a very interesting interpretation that said that economic statements, and that for the purpose of this discussion includes calculative devices, so it doesn't have to be words as such, doesn't have to be books, doesn't have to be articles, journal articles, that sort of thing. They actually have effects on reality. They can create it, or in some other interpretations, they can modify it. Whether we agree with this or not, this has been a very influential interpretation in terms of the role of economists in, for instance, the 2008 economic crisis. What I became interested in, more specifically, is not whether this is true or not, but rather if it is, how. So if we are claiming that knowledge is performative, we need to be able to account for how knowledge statements actually act. I've mentioned three broad framings of how this happens. One is mostly derived from policy studies or policy sociology that emphasizes the role of different policy actors or entrepreneurs in, for instance, bargaining or agenda setting, so framing specific problems for which then they provide solutions. The political, which in this case means politics in the broader philosophical and ideological sense, in which knowledge is used to justify or legitimize the kind of decisions or the kind of value orientations that politicians tend to identify with. But the one thing that I'm particularly interested in, and the one thing that I think we will be focusing on today, is epistemic. So what kind of knowledge disciplines actually bring? What does this allow us to see? But also, interestingly enough, and I'm relying on Lindsay McGooey's work on strategic ignorance here a lot, what do specific disciplinary framings prevent us from seeing? And in relation to this, I want to reference something that has been in the news quite a lot in the past months, and for very good reasons, which is that, for instance, the exclusion of certain disciplinary perspectives from the scientific advice to the UK government when it came to the coronavirus crisis is, in my opinion, what, for instance, enabled everyone in the government to be surprised by the high rate of BME deaths among the general population, or in proportion to the general population impacted by the COVID-19. So in that sense, it is always a question of what certain disciplines choose not to say. But then last but not least, and I think this is where we'll be sort of leaving, or I will be passing it on to Cléo, because this is something that we have discussed at length. What is the relationship between lay and expert knowledge? So what are we assuming that so-called lay people can or cannot understand? Because this is one of the very important things in the whole management of the coronavirus pandemic. So how the government and how scientific advice is communicated to the public rests on very specific assumptions about what kind of statements the public, and again, this is a very broad framing, and I'm drawing attention to how broad it is and what it tends to exclude or not see, what kind of statements the public can understand or cannot understand. So I think I'll stop at that. I have added some references, but I think we can remain on this particular more interesting slide, and then maybe we can go back to some of the specific questions in the discussion. That's it.
Thanks a lot for this very interesting start. I have a lot of questions, and I really, so I'm also kind of working on how ideas and knowledge can change the world or fail to change it. So I guess but I'm looking at it historically, and I really like the way you take into account many different type of aspect of this relation between the knowledge and the world of the reality. And I would like to start by a question on relevance. So there is a history of, and a sort of a lot of analysis of the various conditions that could explain that a certain type of knowledge became relevant at a certain period of time. I think many things insist of what type of individual can be selected to sit at the table, but also what type of institutional aspect that this have. So what's the table and how the table have been put there. But I think what you're like bringing to the conversation is a sort of more fundamental philosophical foundation on the relation between knowledge and the world. And so you briefly talk about performativity, and I would like you to explain a bit more how you use Austin, for example, and how you situate yourself within this literature on performativity.
Okay, great. I think I'll answer the second question first, and then by the virtue of that, hopefully addressing the first one. So the first one was about relevance, so how certain disciplines become relevant, and that's also, in my framing, how they become irrelevant or less relevant. And I think you're absolutely right to emphasize the historical framing of that, in the sense of, well, obviously some disciplines, first of all, disciplines themselves have a history. The idea of a scientific discipline has a history, but also specific disciplines change, or their relevance, or the way that their relevance is framed, changes historically. And then this also has implications for how we think about performativity, because one thing that I am claiming is that performativity does not work in the same way at one point in time and at another. And obviously, one way we can frame this is historically. So, and in that sense, we might come close to those interpretations that argue that the role of scientific knowledge and expertise has overall been reduced in the past, say, 10 to 20 years. But I don't think that is actually the case. So I don't think that when we say performativity is contextual, we say, oh, that means it was true yesterday, but is no longer true today. Rather, what we say is it was true yesterday, but because of these conditions. And obviously, if some of these conditions would obtain today, it might be true again, but it might not. And one of the reasons why I think Austin is very relevant in this sense, but also why I think that Austin has been, I'm trying not to use the word misread or misunderstood, because it's one of the, I think, at least from my point of view, one of the cheapest philosophical tricks to go around claiming that you have the best interpretation of someone else's writing, especially if they're long dead, as Austin is. But I think one of the things that don't get emphasized enough is that Austin actually focused on failures of performativity. So he was, I would say, viscerally aware of the contingency and precariousness of speech acts. And often when we talk about performativity, we don't recognize that enough. Clearly, again, not to be uncritical towards Austin, he was a philosopher. He was an Oxford philosopher as well, a white man at the time when he was. And this means that he engaged very little with all of the interesting questions, including, well, okay, so how would the context actually determine the performativity of a specific speech act? In other words, what kind of social environment we need to have in order for certain words to have power. So in that sense, I'm, in a manner of speaking, I guess, sociologizing Austin, but I'm also drawing attention to the role that our own knowledge of social conditions under which certain speech acts or certain forms of knowledge can become performative actually do act. So in that sense, to answer you were right, we're probably going to talk about this for a very long time. Sorry, to answer your question about relevance, the idea of there needing to be something like a claim to relevance from the perspective of scientific disciplines is itself a very specific and contingent claim. It was, some authors have located it in sort of post-World War II disappointment in the destructive nature of science that obviously followed from, first of all, from nuclear proliferation, the awareness of the role of scientists in the Manhattan Project, as well as in a number of other ethically and morally questionable endeavors, most of which had to do with the Cold War, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, there was this idea that somehow the trust in science has declined, that the public have become more suspicious of scientific claims, and that this means that scientists need to persuade them of relevance. And this is, for instance, where the public engagement and impact agenda in the UK have come from.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting in your assumption is like you study, there is a sort of symmetry between success and failure that has to be studied in the same way. So you could really see what is actually, what the knowledge is doing and not doing. On this, so I really like how you, how some discipline and some knowledge and some people actually have been excluded from claim of relevance, especially right now. So you talk of several type of exclusion. I'd like to hear you about two other type of thing, and I will just start with a very small example. So I work on a failure of performativity, or in the 80s, some people would try to change and increase the value of certain type of work. They had policy leverage. They had the National Science Foundation giving them money. The subject was at the center of an election, a presidential election in the US. So the context was there to produce this relevance of this type of knowledge. And they did several reports. They also have a legal strategy. There were brilliant people, and then it failed. And I think what was interesting is that in the type of knowledge they produce, they were very pragmatic. It include also sort of calculating device to say, oh, how do we increase the value of certain jobs? But it also include a very intensive, reflexive text on the limit of science itself. So the scientific were like saying, okay, we want to do that. We can do that this way, but let's be clear. There is political choice on the sides, and there is us, and there is the limit of science. And when it goes to the policy of the value of work, there is political choice to be made. So and that was emphasized by other type of social scientists coming and saying, yeah, we are scientific, and we think that this is not possible. And so where I want to go, this idea that some type of knowledge are excluded is not separated for me from the rhetoric of how these people present the science. And so there is, of course, the framing effect of the debate. So how the question is asked, who is asked to answer. But there is also, I think, the burden of proof, like who has to prove himself to be relevant. And so I guess this is a bit different if you consider different discipline. And so economists, for example, are on inflation are like sort of self-evident experts. They were not self-evident expert on some issues. And so, yeah, what do you think?
Certainly, I think these are very important questions. I think you're highlighting something that I find incredibly interesting. One is the relevance of communicating certainty or consensus, and thus also, I don't want to say hiding, but perhaps minimizing ambiguity. And I'm one of the people, and there is a lot of good work on this, especially in the context of, for instance, climate change policy by Warren Pierce and some of his colleagues that has come out relatively recently. So I have always claimed that we don't need to overemphasize certainty in order for scientific advice to be taken seriously. But there are many things that militate against this idea that perhaps opening the scientific black box to scrutiny is perhaps not as bad as we think. One is obviously the lack of absolute consensus can be, in some cases, manipulated by different actors who then use it in order to, in some ways, stoke doubt when it comes to some elements. So, for instance, again, in the context of climate change, scientists obviously both disagree and have to disagree about the exact scenarios or the exact rate of change, in part because climate is a very complex system and so on and so forth. But on the whole, they don't certainly disagree that climate change is anthropogenic, so human caused, that it's going to have devastating consequences, and so on and so forth. So when we open that up to scrutiny, obviously climate deniers or so-called climate skeptics can use this then to say, well, look, they don't even know what they're talking about. But I would always argue that this emphasis on what you call the burden of proof, or the idea that science is there to produce incontrovertible evidence that always holds true, is in and of itself a product of a historical process which is the weaponization of this idea that trust in science has been somehow reduced, and that thus scientists basically need to go around peddling their wares. They have to persuade the public of the relevance of scientific research or scientific knowledge. And to go back to the thing that Alice has mentioned briefly in relation to some of my previous work, the political and historical contextualization of this pressure obviously came with the broader defunding or reduction of funding in for higher education and research. So the idea was that once governments have decided to switch to or introduce neoliberal policies in the domain of knowledge production, then those scientists who could pitch best were the ones who deserved funding, and according to this very Darwinian logic, everyone who couldn't did not really deserve it. I think this tells us something about disciplines a lot. So I think that this overemphasis on certainty or consensus created or is one of the reasons why there is the whole idea that somehow scientists have to prove something, so that the burden of proof actually rests on scientific knowledge production. The other, which I think is also very interesting, is that in that sense, it also interestingly leaves or prioritizes the kind of science that cannot be meaningfully engaged with by so-called lay public, or where the threshold of entry into scientific discussion with experts is actually very high. Because one of the reasons why, for instance, we know that some social sciences and humanities are being devalued is because there is almost an assumption that anyone could do that. Right? Everyone has an opinion on things that pertain to society or politics or human rights or gender or ethnicity and race and so on and so forth. And I think to some degree, this creates a context in which scientists are really, or those who do social sciences and humanities, are stuck between a rock and a hard place. So either we can choose to enclose scientific discourse in ways that make it impermeable to discussion, but at the same time risk the accusation of irrelevance, or we can open it up to scrutiny. We can really say, look, when it comes to social matters, there is really no way to conclusively prove that class matters and gender doesn't, or, you know, gender matters but race doesn't. Of course not. I mean, all of these things matter. And I think it's I don't want to argue for the two cultures kind of approach in part, because I don't believe in it. But I think that in many ways, the idea of openness to discussion, not the kind of free speech debate openness to discussion, but actual openness to discussion, and the idea that the public could actually be meaningfully involved in co-production, to use that somewhat cheapened term of scientific knowledge, has in that sense been devalued and often used against scientific knowledge producers.
Yeah, I think I agree a lot on what you said, especially the challenge of closure and not closure. And this brings me to a sort of last question, I guess, because some questions from the audience are coming about the so the sort of link. So I want to go back to the sort of Hunger Games of the social science and the idea that you have a link between the structure and functioning of different disciplines, their sort of conception of science, of scientific practice, and how this is related to external authority. So you talk about the sort of consensus, not consensus, should we hire or didn't hide, what's inside the black box. And I think different social science have different way to do that. For example, economics is very hierarchical. They're more homogeneous in some, in a very more consensual on the tools to be used. The boundary work is done very efficiently. You have the enforcement of standards very, very efficiently, and different of modes of justification, but that doesn't really allows for like pluralism or something like this. I think political science, public policy, sociology, other disciplines are different regarding this sort of structure. And so I wonder, of course, there is no mechanical causality, but in the case of economics, if you look historically, the fact that it has been this homogeneous body have impacted its relation to power, but it's not a necessary condition. And so that's of course related to the big old debate about, okay, is there social laws? What methods should we use? But if we go back to the sort of competitive aspect, which I think the university is also producing in terms of like funding of the social sciences, is there like this sort of link between the structure of the professions, the structure of the type of knowledge, and this sort of external authority, and do you see it differently for different discipline?
That's great. And I will say this is obviously an empirical question, and I'm saying this only by way of saying there are many people who work on this, and I think, you know, it would be kind of too long to list everyone, but I think that this work is one of the most interesting types of work when it comes to policy studies, which I think are often somehow as a field or as a discipline for some reason ignored in the UK. But I definitely think that institutionalization matters. Forms of education matter as well. So the way that economics is being taught, but also, and may I just do this one, your favorite slide again, this one again. The way that economics is being presented to the, again, for want of a better term, the generalized audience. I have been talking about this to a lot of people in different contexts, but I find it's really interesting that although we are regularly told, and I think most people would probably agree, that economics is economy is very relevant. Economy is something that we engage with on a daily basis. You know, we are told that we need to get back to work in order to restart the economy and so on and so forth. Relatively few people know enough about or enough of economics in order to be able to judge what is sound economic policy or not. And for an area of social life that is being made so relevant, I find it very interesting that it's somehow not being taught more broadly. So not only in the context of the training of economics students, because that is obviously professionalized training and professionalized socialization, but also more generally. And I mean, there have been a lot of initiatives to change this in terms of people's economics and so on and so forth. And I think they're really, really great. And very useful in this sense, but I think it also shows us how far away we are from where we need to be in order to be able to meaningfully challenge some of the economic orthodoxies that are being presented as common sense. But again, not common sense in the sense of everyone could understand them, but common sense in the sense of it's not rational of you to doubt this or to question this, and if you would try, then you certainly wouldn't have the tools to. So I think that is definitely one of the elements of disciplinary and also epistemic enclosure. And I think the other is, and you're absolutely right about this as well, I mean, the other is, yes, policymakers and politicians favor relatively clear and unambiguous evidence, because as we have seen, and I have to say, it seems that Boris Johnson is increasingly coming to this position as well, it allows them to somehow avoid responsibility. So basically saying science says, a bit like the game of Simon Says, right? So science says this means we have to do this. So we're not choosing to do this. And I think this really brings the question back onto the what I think is the core element of the social aspect of performativity, which is the question of political power.
Thanks.
Great. We've got lots of questions coming in the chat, so I'm gonna start reading some of them out. I obviously have a ton of my own, Jana, given that I work on this too, and it would be great to we'll catch up and ask you those at some point. But I'll pass on to, I think Jack feels his has been largely answered, but we might come back to it because I think there's kind of some interesting extensions of that. But Carlos Mwanga's asking, do you think that the current COVID-19 pandemic would accelerate the tendency to neoliberalism in higher education and the defunding of scientific research, or will it be the other way around? I guess maybe we could also ask what kind of disciplines might this end up alleviating or kind of eroding the authority of in those funding structures too?
I mean, I have two answers, and they're possibly mutually exclusive, as I mean, I guess, as reflects very well my own comfort with ambiguity. One is, yes, obviously it will exacerbate the existing neoliberal tendencies, if by neoliberal tendencies we understand the drive of governments to use universities as extractive resources for generating profit, and or to force universities to act, meaning university leadership to act in this way. I'm thinking of the push to somehow make sure that international students who pay disproportionately high tuition fees can still participate in education, even if at the cost of actually risking both their health and obviously the health of staff, in order to make sure that they get the full experience. I'm thinking about the removal or likely removal of EU students from home student status in the UK, which obviously also means that they will be paying higher tuition fees equal to international former overseas students before, and so on and so forth. So the logic of extractive profit is certainly still there. And to be fair to universities, including university leadership, on the current funding structures, they don't have a lot of choice otherwise, because they're reliant either on governments or on international student fees. And obviously those universities that are relatively well off, including ours, also have investments and endowments, but also, to be quite fair, given the global economic crunch, none of those are completely impervious to risk. So in that sense, everyone is in a losing game. It just depends on who goes down, who goes under first. On the other hand, in terms of defunding or selective funding, I think we're going to see something very interesting, which is not only investment into the kind of knowledge that can help solve the coronavirus pandemic, most obviously develop a vaccine, but also develop a number of other measures. I think we're going to see very clearly an investment in the kind of knowledge that's useful to powerful political actors, which has been the case for a long time. This is the idea of most sort of public-private partnerships. This is the idea of knowledge transfer as well. So all of these things are part of that agenda. But on the other hand, I think we're going to see an amplification of that. So I think we're going to see, we're definitely seeing a shift from what we normally think of as neoliberalism, including neoliberalism in knowledge production, towards, I would say, perhaps a more muscular form of authoritarian neoliberalism. And I personally find that very scary, not so much in terms of higher education and research, although obviously for that as well. I mean, it's my job as well, my livelihood as well, but in terms of its broader implications in securitization, consequences for people who are vulnerable, such as immigrants or anyone with any kind of special needs or anyone who's visibly different, I think it's going to be very scary. So.
Yeah, that's a very kind of sobering note. Maureen O'Dwyer is on a kind of slightly different note, wondering what are the specific things we can learn from differentiating knowledge or expertise based on disciplines rather than different criteria. So is there a risk that we collapse a lot of different approaches to knowledge under disciplinary headings? So for example, I know that the anthropologists have actually had quite a lot to say on that committee. I don't know, and I know they're kind of doing their best, I think, to envelope various other different approaches within that.
Oh yes, absolutely. And I think, I'm someone who, as you mentioned at the very start, has more or less pursued a career that, or an academic trajectory that aimed to subvert this idea of disciplinary boundaries. But I think in part from that perspective, because I, equally identified as, I guess, sociologist and anthropologist, philosopher, I worked at the Department of Political Science for some time, and so on and so forth. I think I'm also aware of the fact that disciplinary boundaries are not as porous as we would like to think. And they are, at least when it comes to legitimation and justification of knowledge, they're actually pretty solid. And I think we can see that very clearly, not only in funding structures, but specifically in structures of recognition of the relevance of scientific evidence or scientific expertise. So in that sense, it is really a question of, well, okay, so what does anthropology stand for? Because I think I have a very good idea of what kind of anthropology ended up with a seat at the table. So in that sense, I think it is really the interaction between certain disciplines beginning to stand for certain things, and then practitioners of these disciplines actually adjusting themselves, at least when it comes to public communication or expertise, to the standards that their disciplines are somehow expected to bring. And this is another, I think, element that helps us think more creatively about the notion of performativity. Do we conform to disciplinary identities even though we might not abide by them?
Yeah, great. I should defend the anthropologists on the committee and say that I know that they are really foregrounding questions that I think sociologists, gender scholars, etc., geographers would really foreground as well. But that's just a note of. Adam Standring's asking what your thoughts were on the performativity of your knowledge in the state. So one of the things that we've seen during the pandemic is a proliferation of national comparisons, cases, testers, mortality, and a number of countries going along their own paths while claiming to follow the science. So the UK versus Sweden, etc. And he wonders what this has to say about the idea of knowledge claims relating to universal/global versus kind of specific local.
That's a brilliant question, and I'm actually writing another article that hopes to engage with this particular aspect in more detail. But just to give a very brief answer, I think, much like with other things, it's an interesting interplay between knowledge and ignorance. Because what kind of countries are used as standards or are used as data points in comparisons, and what kind of data that is very interesting, as well as what is excluded from it. So depending on the venue or source you look at, sometimes obviously very, very specific, including World Health Organization data, features elements or estimates about what is included or what is excluded from data. But often it is really just a question of comparing to a very specific case. So, for instance, one of the figures that have recently been more present, but are still, I think, relatively invisible in public discourse about the management of the coronavirus pandemic in the UK is the number of excess deaths. So deaths that would have occurred, so the number of deaths that goes above the number of deaths that would have occurred annually due to all other causes combined, so natural accidents and so on and so forth. And that's a staggering figure, because that figure in itself, for instance, and it's possible to break it down regionally as well. So that figure itself sort of pierces the government bubble of, oh, well, it's anyway sort of the elderly and the frail, so, you know, this isn't that bad on the whole. So, for instance, that's one of the figures that show very clearly, I think, in my view, what kind of knowledge has been used to predict and manage and mitigate or not the pandemic. The other is the aforementioned number of BME deaths. So, you know, in that sense, that came up very, very late, comparatively speaking, in the discussion. We know that the report itself has been sort of postponed and then buried for a while. So to me, it's always a question of, well, okay, so what is used, but also what kind of data is not being used.
Yeah, returning slightly to the theme that we were just on, so moving back a bit, Paul Reeves kind of asking if you've got any thoughts on the interactions between efforts to convince the public that particular disciplines understand a problem or situation and the constitution of publics or constituencies that will support the role of either disciplinary experts or relevant factors in public life and decision making. So how performativity also depends on the societal spread for the support for an emphasis on particular forces or factors or disciplines. And Rebecca's wondering, perhaps we can link it to that question, what the differences between, say, sociology and anthropology might be in that respect.
And I've also listed in the nerdy reference list, which was the last slide. I've listed an article by Elizabeth Anderson that actually Anna Alexandrova, who's also from CRASSH, reminded me of through a very interesting post that was published on the CRASSH website not long ago, which deals with lay assessments of expert testimony. And for instance, Elizabeth Anderson argues, and this is the very liberal view, but I think it's one that's worth re-engaging with, that there are hierarchies, for want of a better term, expertise, and that we should, in that sense, when we think of audiences, understand that, say, the ability of someone with a PhD in a related discipline to understand disciplinary discourse from, say, or in epidemiology is obviously not the same as the ability of someone who perhaps doesn't have higher education and so on and so forth. I don't want to overstate this because it's very easy to use this argument to argue for some sort of first of all, epistemic hierarchy, and then worse, epistocracy. So, you know, people with higher education should be allowed to have more of a say, and then also we can audit them in that sense. I mean, to be very open about, especially about the class structure of most societies, we're talking about today and in general, this happens anyway, except that obviously it isn't everyone with higher education, specifically people who studied at specific elite universities and have been party to specific networks of influence, privilege, and so on and so forth. And economics, again, at least in its guise as, you know, politics, philosophy, and economics, has a very specific role to play there. So I would say we definitely should engage with the idea of different publics, precisely because, yes, it's clear that people don't have the same opinions, people don't have the same capacity to process scientific information. When I say capacity, I certainly don't mean that in the behavioral science way. I mean it in the sense in which people's capacity to process certain kinds of information depends on their overall attention span, and their attention span depends on what they're made to do during the day and what kind of time they have and how much of a cognitive freedom they can exercise. So obviously we shouldn't be expecting the same things, as I'm sure anyone who's been trying to work from home whilst homeschooling has discovered. We shouldn't expect the same sort of attention or the same sort of cognitive performance from someone who's being interrupted by children every 3 minutes, and from someone who doesn't have that sort of pleasure or not pleasure, depending on how you see it. So in that sense, I think we really need to acknowledge that how people can engage with scientific evidence depends on a lot of things, and some of these obviously have to do with class or socioeconomic background and the way in which people have, or most often do not have, the freedom to choose what kind of information they engage with. But it also depends clearly on what kind of information is available. So.
Yeah, thanks, Jana. I'm just going to give everyone a heads up, just so we can ask the last couple of questions. I think we're going to go kind of 5-10 minutes past 10 minutes past the hour, perhaps, and then we'll kind of stop. Elizabeth Pop-Berman is wondering, in the current crisis, how do you think discipline matters in the production of numbers itself? So, or are there disciplinary differences? For example, how might we approach counting tests and antibodies and so on secondary to other factors? So she says that this question is prompted partly by the US case in which national statistics have broken down. And one of the most prominent national tracking efforts is run by journalists at The Atlantic, so volunteers with no particular disciplinary allegiance.
I think that's a very good question, and there have been more people arguing recently that perhaps we're seeing I was going to say a renaissance, but perhaps not a renaissance, sort of an amplification of citizen science and the role of different kinds of epistemic communities that might not be otherwise, or in general, social groups that might not normally be thought of as groups that tend to provide or produce knowledge and evidence. But I think we also need to be quite cautious in the sense in which disciplines are, at the end of the day, bound by specific, hopefully at least, by specific standards of evidence and specific criteria. And when it comes to a lot of knowledge production that's being done outside of that, that can certainly be useful, but we also need to be mindful of some of the, I mean, first of all, the sort of quality of data that's produced when it's produced in very speedy, in a very speedy manner, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I would say, ideally, we would have a bit of a mix. So we would have scientific or disciplinary evidence, and then open it to scrutiny, in part because that in that way we can hopefully start to perhaps dig a bit at those disciplinary walls. But I would certainly say that in some ways disciplines have been policing their boundaries quite well, and I think that has to do with, during the current pandemic, I think it has to do with the awareness that biggest cuts are yet to follow. So in that sense, it's almost as if disciplines or people who identify with specific scientific disciplines are feeling, at least this is my impression, are feeling pushed to preemptively demonstrate their relevance only in order to make sure that perhaps they can get a slightly bigger piece of cake when it comes to funding in the next round. And I think that this clearly connects to the aforementioned and coming or continuation of the crisis of funding of higher education and research, and it's probably going to be quite nasty.
Yeah, I'm certainly acutely aware of that myself. So just the last couple of questions, one quite specific and then one quite broad in a way. or specific to the SAGE model. So Hannah is wondering, you know, there was this push to kind of make clear the science and make open transparency of following the science. And SAGE have been doing a lot of kind of the independent SAGE has kind of been holding this accountable, so to speak. So they've got their own YouTube channel where a scientific group of experts discuss COVID, etc. So she's wondering, kind of, we also hear a lot from some of the sciences at the daily briefing, but alongside ministers. So she's wondering, in your view, what for the public's understanding of decisions and perhaps rebuilding trust in science, is the independent SAGE method of trying to separate the science from the politics the way forward? Or should there continue to be a single communication channel with scientists and ministers, as with the briefings? And if the latter, what ways can trust be regained within this format? I'm thinking particularly of, you know, it's not clear where the initial impetus of kind of behavioural fatigue, for example, came from, because nobody's owning that one. But anyway, we don't have to focus on that here. But yes, in what ways could trust be regained within that?
Yeah, no herd immunity for that matter. I think that's a great question. I would always say, from my point of view, it's not about having a unitary voice, again, because I think that overemphasizes consensus, which on most accounts, beyond the very obvious, such as, yes, you know, coronavirus is a virus, it's harmful, climate change exists, it's human-made and it's harmful to humans. Beyond that, often isn't there, at least not in the way in which the media likes to think there is. But I think, on the other hand, what we always could do and argue for as citizens, as academics, as people, is that there needs to be more of what needs to be open to scrutiny is the conduit through which scientific evidence is made into policy, because that is what is missing. I think the independent SAGE does, in that sense, a very good job of evaluating scientific evidence that is used as the basis for policy, and that's great. And I think we should have more of these communities, and hopefully have them composed of also slightly more diverse disciplinary and more diverse in all sorts of ways. But I think what's still missing in this account is, how do decision makers actually select what kind of evidence they use? How do they make decisions on the basis of evidence? And as someone who has worked as policy advisor, I'm also aware of the fact that this process is neither simple nor straightforward. So in that sense, one of the things I think will help re-establish the trust in science would be to say, well, okay, this is what we have advised. And then people can hopefully compare what forward as scientific advice and what has been implemented. At this point, we really need to look at politics and policy advice first. So in that sense, the whole spotlight on science, the whole spotlight on scientific evidence in itself, though obviously wonderful for people like me who work on sociology and politics of knowledge production, is, on the other hand, really detrimental in the sense in which it draws attention from the fact that these decisions are, at the end of the day, taken by politicians.
One last question to end with before we go. David Abbott is wondering, should the social sciences aim to be deliberative rather than performative?
That's a nice one. It's also a very good question about whether social sciences are aiming to be performative and in what way. But that's a I would say that's separate. I'm not going to be answering that one, because that's going to take another hour, or possibly about 9,000 words. But nonetheless, I think being deliberative would be a very good idea, again, were it not for the socio-political and economic context that presses or that pushes towards uniformity, consensus, and clear evidence. So in that sense, I think it always depends on where. I mean, it would be great if if social scientists or social sciences disciplines were more deliberative. It would also be great if they were a bit more interdisciplinary, which is something that we like to claim on funding applications, but are often somewhat slower to implement in practice, especially when it comes to opening up our own epistemic assumptions, not to mention ontological ones, to scrutiny. But on the other hand, I do think that that should not be mutually exclusive with giving very specific advice, because if nothing else, we can always present things in, or we should be able to present things in a relatively clear and straightforward manner, and then say, well, okay, this is what we think on this issue or question right now. This might change in relation to these things, and obviously these are the things that we're not taking into account. So I think we should definitely be more deliberative in certain domains of practice, but that in and of itself doesn't mean that it would not also be useful to be strategically perhaps a bit less deliberative when it comes to communicating certain elements of scientific knowledge at this point in time. But that might sound a bit cynical, or yeah. So I'm not sure this is what I will tell my students.
That's great, Jana. Thank you just for all of that to kind of take away. There's a lot there to think about and unpack more, and I hope that we can do that. I look forward to Cléo and you and I meeting up at some point soon, but also maybe we can kind of continue that conversation, certainly on Twitter, if people would like to join and put any questions or comments. We have a hashtag, and I haven't said hashtag in a very long time. I think I've lost it. Yeah, it's hashtag PolEconCovid-19. So if you want to continue the conversation there, that's great. And then we're going to be talking about quite similar themes in some ways, certainly related with Will Davies in our next seminar, on what we think is our next seminar on Tuesday, the 7th of July at 1 p.m. So please do join us then. And thank you, Jana, for all of that food for thought for the rest of the day.
Thank you both, and thanks everyone for questions. It was a pleasure.